corals are really interesting in that they're able to live in lots of different habitats and they're able to colonise these different places, but they're also really quite sensitive to change, probably because they're so long-lived and they're in these places for such a long time, which is why we're starting to hear about things like coral bleaching, which is happening all the way from the tropical reefs that we immediately think of when we talk about reefs and bleaching, even down here to Sydney Harbour and also Lord Howe Island where there's been bleaching.
Tropicalisation refers to the redistribution of species that we're seeing because of climate change. So specifically it's about the warmer water species like corals and fish coming further down south, even to Sydney. What we've been seeing more recently is warmer waters. So particularly in 2016 we had a really big global bleaching event, and what we found in Sydney Harbour as well was that corals were actually bleaching, so the temperatures were rising to about 26 degrees. So that was about 2 degrees hotter than normal, so something really unusual. Coral bleaching is actually a stress response for the corals, so when the water's either too warm or it's too acidic or there's not enough light, the corals actually start to bleach. So what we mean by that is they lose their pigments, and what you're left with is seeing the coral skeleton, and that's the same as human skeletons. It's the calcium carbonate skeleton. Essentially it is an animal and it has plants inside, so we would say it's both. It's not a rock like a lot of people think, it is a living organism, and it involves this incredible symbiosis between the plant and animal components, and that exists because the animal provides protection, living space and nutrients, and the algae provides oxygen, photosynthesis and that kind of thing. We already know quite a lot about what's happening in coral reef ecosystems. Their role has been recognised sort of over the last 30 years, and we know that they're very important for coral health, nutrient cycling and productivity, but their role in these temperate systems, there's just very little known about them.
One of the really interesting region for corals in New South Wales and also globally is the Solitary Islands region, which is off Coffs Harbour. It's a marine park, and we have offshore islands there that are up to 11 kilometres offshore, and they are in the pathway of the East Australian Current, which brings warmer sort of tropical waters down along the coast. In this region, therefore, we find very diverse coral assemblages where over 80 species have been recorded. We have an overlap of tropical species with temperate species. These systems are also already changing through warming. We have had an influx of tropical species, and we have recorded some shifts in corals distribution. Species that you typically only find on, to the north or on the Great Barrier Reef have expanded already their distribution southward. We're trying to understand how these systems function, how they're likely going to change with climate change, because these dynamics, how these species interact with each other, are really not very well understood at this stage.
So when most people think of coral, they think of stony corals, which are what are like the majority of corals in places like the Great Barrier Reef. But the second most common kind of coral is soft coral. Soft corals are related to hard corals, but instead of having a stony skeleton inside, they have like a fleshy layer. So they're much more flexible and they can move in the water. And they're still a really important habitat for fishes and crustaceans and baby lobsters and like all the things that we really care about in the ocean. Some soft corals work in the same way as the majority of hard corals, where they do have the symbiotic relationship between the algae and the animal. But some of them are azooxanthellate, which means they have no zooxanthellae, which is the name of the algae that lives inside them. So the soft corals that are in Sydney Harbour are one of these azooxanthellate corals. And because of that, they actually look quite different. Corals with zooxanthellae look the color of algae, so they're like a brown or a green, maybe a little bit red, whereas these corals are electric pink because they don't have that zooxanthellae, so they're seeing the color of the actual flesh of the coral. The populations in Sydney were basically wiped out. We think it was in the 70s, and so what we're trying to do is eventually get these corals back into the harbour. And we're doing this by studying the populations that still exist in Botany Bay where they're really healthy, learning how we can transplant them and bring them back to areas where they have been removed.
Corals are extremely valuable ecosystems for a lot of different reasons. Despite only covering a really small fraction of the Earth's surface area, they're home to about a quarter of all marine species, and a lot of marine species actually have various stages of their growth and development within coral reefs, so they provide a nursery and that kind of thing as well. The organisms and the microbes that live and persist within coral reef ecosystems actually contribute to the oxygen we breathe. So 50%, or 1 in every 2 breaths that we take, is actually coming from the ocean. So we have a lot of thanks to give to the coral reefs. They're just really incredibly diverse and productive ecosystems that a lot of other animals rely on. So we do need them, and they are definitely under threat.
The problem for corals is the temperatures that they're being exposed to now are outside what they've been exposed to before. That human-induced change is too much for them to cope with. This is something we've known for a really long time, and it's a shame that we're not changing fast enough to make a difference on reefs.
So when you're swimming through a bleached reef, it really is one of the saddest things you can ever see. But I find motivation in knowing that my research will help us understand how reefs are reacting to the bleaching, how they're going to change in the future. Once a disaster like that happens, you can never really go back to what you used to have, but you can understand and kind of enhance what you can predict is going to happen in the future.
It is really important that we understand them better so we can manage them into the future. For example, we need to know which species are likely going to migrate south, what are their characteristics, where are they likely going to, find a home, where are they likely going to settle along the coast. And then we can use this information for placement of marine reserves, trying to minimise existing stressor on these reefs so we can protect them into the future.
I think people probably feel quite powerless, and maybe that small changes is outside what they can control or what they can contribute. But I think it's really important that people understand that every little bit counts. Everything they do, every change they make contributes to how society as a whole changes, and that's the only way that we're going to make a difference for reefs, is if everyone changes a little bit. What they can do is they can go away and talk about how important it is to them, to their children, to their grandchildren, that these environments are there, that they're beautiful, that they're inspiring for people whether they live in the city or whether they live right next to a reef. If people are talking about these environments and that they matter, that they're talking to their politicians, that they're talking to government and saying this is a high priority for us, we need to do better, then society together can actually start to change. People can make a difference.
It's definitely going to happen. I have to believe that. I think we should all believe that, and I think we should all fight for it to happen sooner rather than later.
Even smaller things, or stuff like not using your straws or refusing plastics, and having a think about how you use different items around the house, like your clothing, and reusing and repatching these kinds of things. All of that actually contributes to, your carbon footprint and the carbon emissions that you have.
You don't need to be someone who's going to go and swim out in 20-metre water. You can just, swim around the rocks and go slowly and just have a look at what life is there, and realise that life relies also on us doing the right thing on land.
Taking your first breaths underwater and experiencing something that's just completely different. It's like an alien world. It's very special in that sense. It really is something valuable and special, and it's something that I want everyone to be able to experience.
When I tell people about the work that I'm doing about, studying corals in New South Wales, people are like, oh, what, corals in New South Wales? The breadth of life that we have they're very diverse areas, not only for corals, but, in combination with all the other species. They're really special places.
I would hope to get the populations that used to be here that we know about back into full swing, and I would love to see the seahorses back in these soft corals. I think that would be absolutely amazing. And maybe put a little colony here at Sims just so that we could have them.
So the idea is just to have these ecosystems persist into the future, so not just we're lucky enough to enjoy these things, but the future generations can as well.
I think that we all really do have this connection to nature, which is important to our well-being, to our mental health, to how we feel about our place in the world, and I think it's important for people to remember that.